Good morning, everyone. To those of you who are joining already to this closing event of Sustainability Week, we're very glad to have you here and thank you for waking up early in the morning, which is something that we appreciate, obviously. Today we have here two very important and professional speakers who are going to share their insights from different fields. And you might know them if you're coursing currently the degree under their schools of architecture and School of Global and Public Affairs, but also if you're coursing another degree, because they're very well-known figures within IE and with a lot of experience. And we're going to be discussing something which I think is essential in the sustainability agenda, which is the matter of inclusion and the idea that no one should be left behind. And we should take this opportunity of making changes to also take into account how can we change the way that our society works and the opportunities that people have to participate in the society and to have access to resources or respect for their rights, which I think is essential. So in this overarching theme of how can we design a more inclusive world, we have prepared a couple of questions, which Susana Malcorra and Martha Thorne will be answering. And at the end of this session, you will have the chance to voice your questions as well. Please do so through the chat, and I will be asking those questions to both of the deans. To start off with a question for both of you, I think it's important when we're talking about inclusion to define the concept and to understand what it means in practice. It has been defined by the UN as a process of improving participation in society for people who are disadvantaged, enhancing opportunities. But how would you define it from your perspective and based on your experience? How can we define and measure inclusion? The floor is yours.
Okay, I'll chip in here. First of all, thanks for inviting us to take part of this conversation. It's great to have the chance to speak about this subject with Martha. Inclusion is a very, very broad concept. And when you look at Agenda 2030, which is based on inclusion, remember, the theme is not leaving anyone behind, which means including everyone. And you take a look at the objectives and the measurement, the KPIs that the agenda has. It has over 180 KPIs. So, measuring is one way to approach it. And there are ways, and there has been established ways, and there are follow-up mechanisms, and the governments have their bureaus on statistics handling this. But I think there is a more important way to measure it, and that is the sense of, in a society, how people have equal opportunities. And this is something that we are far from achieving. And equal opportunities can be of all sorts. Can be equal opportunities as citizens, to have a voice and a say in participating in the political processes. And that's the basis of democracy. But we know for a fact that that is not necessarily working well. It is equal opportunity to participate in the economic activities and to have a fair share of those economic activities, to contribute to them in a fair manner, and to get rewarded in a fair manner. Because we know, for example, that women do participate to almost an equal level in the economic activity, but the disparity in the retribution is huge. So that's another way to measure equality. Then the access to education, the access to health, the access to the basic goods that are required as citizens, all of those are measures of equality, of equal access, but also the notion of inclusion underpins all of that. So there are many ways to cut this cake, many ways to approach it, but in the end, this motto of not leaving one behind is the one that represents what we want and what we should do.
I think it's a great question, Raquel, and I always love to participate with Susana because we see that our points of view are complementary, although they come from different starting points. And if we look at architecture and design, I would echo the idea that inclusion is a very broad topic. And when we're looking at the physical, natural, or digital environments, which is the realm in which we work at the School of Architecture and Design, we see many different scales. And we can look at the city scale and try to see how can we include people or not divide people, or that people have equal opportunities to urban services, but also the layout of our cities has to be inclusive, so that we're not making one group or one segment of the population travel great distances for certain services or for their places of employment. So equality or accessibility can be reflected in the physical environment of a city. But then it also can come down very much to a community or a neighborhood level. And that means that the people in that area feel empowered, absolutely through the democratic process of elections, but also having a voice in their community about what the future may mean to them, what the physical environment should contain. And in that sense, it goes along also with an attitude in society that each person has something to contribute in very different ways. Architects, urbanists, policymakers all have expertise, and they have a contribution to make. They have expertise, technical know-how, but they have to believe that the residents of a community can improve their proposals or their projects if they participate in a real way. And that's not just going on the internet and with a multiple choice question, but it's a much more, it's a much richer dialogue. And then finally, the only other thing that I think is, it's common in a lot of things we do, we assume people are like us. And inclusion means assuming that we're only one tiny part of the equation, and that there are people from many different sectors, many different demographic groups, people who see the world in a different way. So I say this because I'm on juries often, and it's very easy to be empathetic when someone is close to one's own profile. But the challenge for inclusion is to have that sensitivity to those who are different. Young children, older people, people who have certain special needs, in my case, men or others. So I think inclusion has many layers, from the city to the individual, from policy, from the physical environment to individual behaviors.
Thank you both so much for such detailed answers and very precise. I think you tackled the different aspects that are involved in inclusion. And now I think it's also important to talk about who are those actors which are also pushing for inclusion, and in which ways can we achieve it. So the second question is particularly for Dean Susana Malcorra, taking into account your experience in international organizations. How do you think they play a role in fighting for a more inclusive world? For instance, the World Food Programme recently received a Nobel Prize, and you have been working there, from my understanding, from 2004 till 2008. So how do you see that those organizations can play a role, and how can individuals contribute to those organizations from their perspective, even if they're not within the organization?
It is clear that the international organizations, the multilateral system, play a significant role. To begin with, Agenda 2030 was generated by broad consultation from the UN, and so that shows to you that there is a very important role to be played in bringing together the 193 member states and having the opportunity in bringing them together to agree to a shared perspective of the future of the world. So that is something that is important. The second thing that is important is that evolves into policy design that is clear, coming from the UN, should put pressure on governments to develop those policies and enact them, that probably wouldn't do naturally in their own. Peer pressure that is set by the UN defining the framework of new policies is fundamental. And that has been the case, for example, with Beijing and the whole gender agenda that really was developed and was pushed through in many parts of the world against what would have happened naturally just out of peer pressure coming from member states and the UN. So that's one aspect. The other aspect, of course, is the presence of these organizations in the field trying to minimize the impact of poverty, of inequality, the effects of tsunamis, the effects of different crises, either natural or man-made. You mentioned World Food Program, the role that World Food Program plays trying to really get close to those most in need and try to avoid children dying because from starvation. Those things are significant, but I will emphasize that these are somehow band-aids to the problem. And to me, the fundamental question is the question of defining policy and having governments, a private sector and civil society working together within their space to really make things happen, so that you have to avoid the usage of band-aids. So that will be the key message here.
I completely agree, and it links very nicely to a question that we'll have a bit later on. But before asking the question, I wanted to give the floor back to Martha as well and ask, which steps do you think architects can take when they're designing those inclusive space you were talking about and that physical environment? Precisely, international organizations have defined in the Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities that we should have a universal design, right, that includes everyone and that does not oppress people physically, but also, as you were saying, mentally and according to our attitude. So how would you approach this question of inclusive spaces?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think when we look at the field of architecture and the built environment, we have to remember that things go very slowly. It could take a year, 18 months to design and reflect in all the documents that are necessary, a new project for a building, a space, infrastructure, and then it takes months, years to build. So it's a field on one hand that's very slow, and it also means it's resistant to change. The way we construct our physical environment really hasn't changed. Some of the different skills and techniques haven't changed in decades or even hundreds of years. So it's a slow field. So I would look at what are the touch points we can use to speed up a slow field. And one, again, echoing Susana, and this is not planned, but I have to say, is policy. When there are policies, when there are laws to encourage people to change, either through penalties, requirements, or through stimulus, then a slow profession, a slow sector of our economy will go faster. And this is where I look to the European Union, I look to our national governments, our local governments to put in place regulation to encourage people to change more quickly than they would do it on their own. The other area I look to is education. And I think that this is, of course, it's the area the space that we're in. But I think when I look at the students, not only at IE School of Architecture and Design, but I'm in conferences and symposia and final reviews in other schools, I see that students nowadays, they want to understand the tools, the techniques, and the knowledge to create a better world. So I think we as an academic institution, we need to push those changes. We need to discuss what is inclusion, what are the mechanisms we can use, how do we design physical space, digital space, how do we use our natural environment so that it is responsive to all of these people, regardless of their capabilities. And then I think it goes back to what I said in the first question. It has to do with attitude as well, because we can say, well, we have the main stairs in the front of the building, and yeah, we have the ramp around the back. That's not inclusive. That is giving accessibility, but it is treating some people as first class and some people as second class citizens. So I also think we need to change our attitude and realize that maybe a ramp in the front for everyone is the better way to go.
What a great metaphor. I think you put it in perfect words because it applies practically, having the ramp, and also that message, right, of making it accessible and making it inclusive for all, not just having these kind of side possibilities. And I think both of you have brought forward important aspects of the different fields in which you've worked in, but I think it's also important to take into account how can those fields interact, right? How can we make sure that they are coordinated and that the efforts that we push forward for inclusion are also having an overall umbrella perspective of what is the goal that we want to achieve. So my question for both of you would be, how do you think we can encourage this interaction between fields, not just architecture and international relations, but also business or technology or law, and this relationship also between sectors, as you were mentioning, Susana, the private and the public sector? How can they collaborate more closely to ensure that inclusiveness is achieved?
Well, first of all, it is clear that the task before us is daunting. It's a very big task. So to assume that any single institution, any single sector, any single person could really get to the goals is impossible. Having said that, the goals are ambitious, but invite us to work together. I think we are at a time that shows that there are big divides within society, that there is a fracture within society that has many people feeling left behind. And we could do a political analysis about this, and we could look into recent election results to show how divided societies are. And in order to rebuild the fabric of societies, to make them inclusive, we have, in my perspective, to recognize that a new compact, a new social compact is needed. A new agreement on what is it that we require to bring our societies back into a notion of, yes, we disagree on certain things, but in the end, we are all part of the same ship. We all want to go in a certain direction. And to do that, there is no question you have to bring together the government, the private sector, and civil society. We have to sit down around the table and find ways to establish a dialogue that recognizes the other. Martha made a reference to recognizing the ones that are different, accepting them. It is clear that when we look at where societies are today, half of the society doesn't even recognize the other half, not to say that they speak to the other half. They just don't recognize themselves in the other half. So that to me is a prerequisite today to really push for the big reset, admitting that we have done things in a way that have left too many people disenfranchised, both in terms of a political realm, both in terms of the business sector. And that is the fact that that is happening requires for those three parts, the public, the private, and the civil society, to find an agenda. My sense is that Agenda 2030 provide us with a blueprint to get there, but it requires more than something in writing. It requires something that is bought in by all parts, and all parts are ready to contribute, and all parts are ready to recognize that they have to let something go, that in order to rebalance the distribution of power, to rebalance the distribution of richness, every single part has to have something going. They have to let go something. And that is, in my view, the biggest task that leaders in the world have before them to ensure that we really become more inclusive societies.
I'm always thrilled because in these dialogues with Susana, she presents the broad picture that's so inspiring, and maybe then leaves room so that I can talk a little bit more specifically about things at a different scale. And I think when we bring it down to the scale, again, of educational institutions, I think we see a tendency towards transdisciplinary studies. And the School of Architecture and Design works with GPA. We're talking about sharing teachers and how we can develop subjects together. The same thing is in the business school. I, with a colleague, teach a course called You Are the Mayor. And there we're talking about city services, city structure. And of course, we don't address policy directly as Susana and her colleagues would do, but we do see that connection. So I think we do have a role, an immediate role in an educational institution to do that. But I also think it's as we talked about before, the big policies require that individuals agree on the objectives. And if I could give you maybe just not a story, but a simile to illustrate inclusion. If we look at the women's movement, we could see in maybe the late 60s, 70s, it was a time of fighting, of aggressiveness, of protests, of demanding rights, of I would say it was kind of a rough way to go. And if we look at different phases, we could see there were times when the token woman was included to sort of appease the situation. And there was a time when some women were able to attain positions of responsibility. And then people would point out and say, see, so-and-so has made it, why can't you? And that also probably was not the best. I think in recent years, we see another argument. Including women is good for profits. Include women because you'll get more productivity, you'll get a bigger reward. And this worries me as well, because I think our message should be, and I hope we can arrive to a commonality of saying, if we include women, in this case, in this example, everyone will be freer. Everyone will have an opportunity to develop more, to be more humane, to achieve their own personal goals. And I don't think we're there yet. I think we're on the way, but that would just be one example of how inclusion means different things to different people. And the key is for all sectors that are involved in it, realize that the measure of inclusion is not to benefit one or correct a past history, but it's for the benefit of all. And I think we have a lot of work to do in that field.
Thank you both for your responses. And I think the example that you're giving, Martha, links nicely to another question, which I think I'm going to address now. I wanted to ask you both, based on your personal and professional experience, which advice would you give to both men and women and other genders when it comes to achieving the goal of gender equality, both in the professional field and in society in general, which I think is an essential aspect of this matter of inclusion?
I suggest that Martha goes first this time around.
Thank you, Susana. I probably have different advice for women, for men, and then the general population, whether they're students or not. But I would probably say to women students in the field of architecture and design, although you are in the majority in school, and 60%, 55, 60, 65%, the world is not an academic institution. So keep your eyes open, be very observant. If you see injustices, there's not one way to call out those injustices. Sometimes you have to do a frontal attack. Sometimes you have to be very diplomatic. Sometimes you have to wait for the right moment. But I would say call out the injustices when you see them and be generous and supportive of your women colleagues. To men, I would probably say, the tendency in architecture and design and urbanism is towards collaboration. We're there in many aspects, but it's going to be more and more, and we can evidence it, not because it's nice or right, but because those are the tools of the trade. And the people, and especially men, who can operate successfully in a collaborative environment and get the best out of it from others and from themselves, they will be more fulfilled, more successful, however they define that. And then I think to the general young population of professionals in architecture and design, I would say you're going to live a long, long time. People born, I know our students were born before 2007, but 2007 marked the year that in industrialized nations, they said that children born that year would live to be at least 100 years old. So I would say to the general young population, you have a long, long career ahead. We don't know what the future holds. We've seen COVID, but we will see many other challenges. So the old models of power, of control, of being the single author, the individual voice will have no place in the future. That's one thing I can guarantee. So being inclusive, as Susana said, it will allow us to remain in this big ship that we're in and keep going. Otherwise, it'll be the Titanic for all of us.
And building on what Martha just said, I will argue that having decision-making processes that do not fully represent society guarantee that the decisions will not be good. So what is needed is for all societies to be represented with all their nuances in the decision-making processes, private, public, academic, whatever the place where you are. And of course, the first representation that we need to take into account is the gender representation. Women represent more than 50% of societies. Any decision that is taken without women being part of that, at that level, is not a decision that is taken representing what society needs. You know, it's interesting to see that governments take decision on reproductive rights, on the care of children, and most of the time is men who are taking those decisions, or most likely men taking those decisions. So that's the first thing. It's not a matter of right or justice. It's a matter of having the proper way to represent society. So in order to have that inclusiveness, you have to allow for women to hold positions of responsibility and power. So in the end, this is a discussion about power. And in that regard, my message to young women is to really not shy away from this notion that you are seeking to achieve power, the fair share of power that is needed. That's the message. And for men, this is absolutely enriching, having a decision process, and as Martha described it, where you have men and women and other perspectives of society fully represented, will get you to a better place, a more sustainable place, a society that really will have all of us directing the ship to the right place. And lastly, a more mundane message. We all need to share responsibilities, and that starts with families. And I think if we can achieve the point in which men and women are responsible for their families, are responsible for the nitty-gritty doing in their families, that's the first step to achieve this equal representation and this equal opportunity that we are seeking. So sharing not the burden, sharing the responsibility of bringing about a family is central to really having this new world that we want to have.
Thank you both for those answers. I think you reflect very well the need for a change of narrative that we have in this topic, right? Because we often tend to rely a lot on shaming people for certain things. And I think it's also important to take into account what both of you were saying, that this is not something that benefits just one half or just one part of society, but that benefits both and that enriches the process of democracy that we have and our opportunities, and that is essential for inclusion, not only in the gender topic, but also in other aspects and other minorities which should be included into the conversation. And linking to that, I think it's very important when we talk about both history and culture and about how our societies are, that we avoid the domination, right, of certain narratives, of certain perspectives, of what one country believes should be correct or one group of people believe should be correct. And I think I was going to ask this question to Susana only, but I think it can also be open to the narratives that exist in architecture. If Martha, you want to jump in, how do you think we can avoid the domination of certain narratives in your respective disciplines and ensure the representation of minorities and their perspective of how things should be done?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Raquel. I mean, you know, sometimes when I was in the UN, I felt that the UN was too Western centric. And the ones who know me know how much I love the UN and how much I embrace the Charter of the UN and the values and principles that that Charter embodies. But one also must recognize that that was written after World War II with Western powers in charge and with a very Western perspective. So I bring this to the front because it is an example of how you design a fundamental value system with values defined, and sometimes the values are shared, but are defined or written through the Western lens, which is not enough to bring the whole world together. So that is something to me that is essential, and goes back to a